Hey everybody, Pastor Ellie here. So as part of the 3-part series on biblical sexuality that the Well Community Church in Fresno, California is hosting with guest speaker Denny Burk, the series promises a message in which the biblical view of gender identity will be discussed. So, I'm going to be basing this video on a similar talk that Mr. Burk gave at Compass Bible Church in Aliso Viejo, which he offensively called transgenderism. In his talk, he emphasizes 3 main points, the first of which I will address now. Mr. Burke's first point is to say that transgender identity is wrong because there is a distinction that is made between male and female that is biological and solely based on reproduction. Now, he bases this theory on Genesis chapter 1, verses 26 through 28, which takes this passage out of context, both literally and historically, and fails to remember that all of this takes place before the fall in the creation story timeline. This theory also completely invalidates the humanity of people who are born intersex or are dealing with infertility, as well as the biblical eunuch who Jesus addresses in Matthew 19. Note that this passage takes place within a point in time where the Pharisees had approached Jesus with planned questions to try and trick him into saying something that they could refute. Jesus, however, gets to the heart of the matter, their heart. Interestingly enough, Jesus not only gives them a challenge to rethink their literal interpretations of Scripture and Mosaic law on divorce, but then throws in an interesting statement about eunuchs. And those are men who had either been born intersex or who had been castrated, either by choice or by force. Men who had given up their power and privilege in a physical way and thus had been looked down upon by society and the church. He then follows it up by reminding his listeners that the kingdom of God belongs to those who are childlike. You know what children think of their friends? They accept them and they love them unconditionally, cisgender or not. It's the parents who teach them that there's something wrong, something to be feared. And that's something to think about, isn't it? Well, moving on, we see that the second point that he makes is the distinction between male and female is social. But what does he mean by that? Well, again, Mr. Burke points to Genesis, this time to chapter 2, verse 18, along with verses 21 through 25. Now again, as I said in the previous video, Mr. Burke relies on biblical theology and a story that takes place chronologically before the fall. Burke argues that gender is the social manifestation of biological sex, and then goes on to say that the only way to read this passage is to walk away with assigned complementarian gender roles. That the man should have authority and dominion over the woman, whose only job is to be his helpmate. Now, because of this, he argues, anything other than this complementarian theology is unbiblical and sinful. Well, pardon me, Mr. Burke, but I know plenty of amazing women of God who are leading just fine and doing amazing things in the church. To limit God and to dictate that who are the true Christians in this matter is to add commands into the Bible that completely belittle the finished work of Christ on the cross. Now, are we really in a place where we're allowing our interpretations over non-essential theology to dictate how we view our neighbors and our faith? Because to me, that sounds like it's a complete violation of one of the 2 greatest commandments. So, as we start looking at what Mr. Burke is teaching and how he says prescribed and commanded gender roles as found in Genesis seemingly show that the only true Christians in his world are ones that hold to a strict complementarian theology, Well, we can begin to see an often abused theology that not only doesn't take into account the chronology of the fall, but also leaves no room for discussion in how Mr. Burk is teaching it. Now, take for example 1 Corinthians chapter 11, verse 8. Mr. Burk uses this passage, which states that the man does not originate from woman, but woman from man, to remind his listeners that there are distinct social roles that each gender must play. However, Mr. Burk again fails to recognize the context of this passage, in which Paul is addressing an argument within the Corinthian church over what place traditions and customs have in practice as the Gentile communities begin joining the church. Remember, Paul settles this argument with verse 16 when he writes, "Now, I hope you're not going to be argumentative about this. So all God's churches see it this way, and I don't want you standing out as an exception," from the Message translation. Paul goes on then to say that I am getting the picture that when you meet together, it brings out your worst side instead of your best. First, I get this report in your divisiveness, competing with and criticizing each other, and I'm reluctant to believe it, but there it is. And yet Burk argues that these prescriptive gender roles are commands that must also apply to leadership within the church. You know, it's often in my conversations regarding affirming theology that I am accused of eisegesis, or of reading the scriptures with my own biased lens and adding into it things that aren't there. And here we see Mr. Burk adding all sorts of inferences into Genesis 2 without once exegeting the text. Mr. Burk ended this part of his talk by alluding to, out of context again, Matthew 19 verse 6, when he stating, "Now when somebody adopts a gender identity at odds with their bodily identity, they are," quote, "tearing asunder something that God has joined together," unquote. Not only is this a gross misinterpretation of this passage, but remember, this is the response that Jesus gave to what the Pharisees thought was a trick question about divorce. But it's completely harmful, forgetting once again that Jesus follows that up with the affirmation of the eunuch. So, to recap, Mr. Burke's second point, that the difference between men and women are social, are all based on faulty proof texts and are taught with an implicit bias towards male domination and an anti-trans theology. So that's point 2. Remember, Mr. Burk has already told his listeners that trans people are not biblical because the distinction between male and female is biological and based on reproduction, and 2, the distinction between male and female is social, right? So in his third point, he states simply that the distinction between male and female is good, citing 1 Timothy 4, verses 1 through 5, which alludes to false teachers and interestingly enough gives them a characteristic of them forbidding people to marry. But I digress. Anyway, in his statement quoting 1 Timothy by saying everything that God created is good, Burke makes the point that male and female is a good product of the creation. Once again, as in all of his points, he forgets that the creation and God's perfect plan for that was all laid out prior to the fall. Now, I will admit that he does allude to the fall during this point, but he does so along with this passage to teach that the fall, conveniently I might add, did not erase complementarianism and gender roles, which are key components to his theology. He points to the idea that this passage warns against apostates and false teachers, which he considers the LGBTQ community and those who adhere to any other societal structure than a complementarian ideal to be a part of. What Burke fails to note, however, is that Timothy himself was a product of a mixed marriage, something that in its time and not so distant from our own history was looked down upon by society and considered a sin by the religious. kind of makes me wonder if he would teach the same thing racially today as many Christian leaders did, even during the civil rights movement. Now, what's perhaps most disturbing is that Burk ends this point by making the comment, "And you thought the days of Moloch were over," which in essence likens trans-affirming childcare to child sacrifice. Now, think about that for a moment. And ask yourself, what could the possible fruit be of teachings like this? Well, certainly not life-giving. These teachings do not aim to help people and grow and live healthy, productive lives. No, quite the opposite. Take my friend Allison Murphy, for example. Her life has been turned upside down when she lost the life of her precious daughter, Chloe. Because this type of teaching, it creates a world that makes it hard for society, including the parents, to affirm their transgender children. Chloe, a young trans woman from Clovis, California, sadly took her own life because of it. Statistics show that those who identify as LGBTQ+ are twice as likely to commit suicide if they come from homes where teachings like Mr. Burke's are accepted as fact. Jesus said that you will know false teachings by their fruit. And where, I ask then, is the good fruit that this type of teaching is producing? Because I have yet to see it. You see, I'm not taking the time out to talk about this so urgently because I just needed something to do. Truth be told, people like Mr. Burke are out there, and they're going to say what they're going to say. But this particular appearance means that when I go back to Fresno to visit my kids, I may have less friends, less community, and less of an ability to simply walk down the street in that area without being confronted and condemned. It means that friends of mine who I've been counseling with as they've come out will experience more widespread condemnation from one of the area's largest churches and its members. Now, I don't pretend to know all the answers, and I sometimes wonder, truth be told, if I'm right. But at the end of the day, I choose to love, because that's what Jesus called us to, isn't it? It was Rachel Held Evans who reminded me in her last book, Wholehearted Faith, that the opposite of faith is certainty. Now, I share all of this with you in hopes that you would know that there are ways to view the acceptance of LGBTQ+ people as biblical. I'm open about my entire story because I need you to know that I'm not the scary person in the woman's bathroom that you've been taught to fear. I'm simply a woman who loves God, who has been told too many times by the church that I'm not allowed to be part of it because of who I am. And that narrative, it needs to change. You see, I used to hate God. I used to hate that this was my struggle, even while serving as leader and pastor. Truth be told, I did so much of it in hopes that this would all just go away, that Jesus would save me from it. But then I came out, and now all of that pain has been lifted. I have never loved God more, because now I have come to accept and love who I am, recognizing that it's not a surprise to God. My faith has moved from pain to joy since coming out, and that has meant everything to me. And for as much as Mr. Burke teaches about the trans community, there is a huge difference between knowing about something and living it. So I hope this gives you food for thought, because the things that you believe, do, and say are powerful. They give us the ability to build up, to tear down, or to destroy. And may we be people who seek to build, not for ourselves, but for the world at large. Well, I'm Pastor Ellie. Thank you for watching. I hope that this message gives you hope and brings some of the tools that you need to bring life into your communities. Because at the end of the day, that's the gospel. If you would, please take a moment to share this message, perhaps on social media or with a friend, especially if you're in the Fresno area and are a member of the Well Community Church. Now, if you have any questions or want more resources, you can reach out to me at my website, pastorellie.com, or on my Facebook page at Pastor Ellie. My own personal story is now also available to purchase from Amazon.com, called Walking Towards Cordelia. Well, until next time, God bless, and may you find comfort in loving the people around you.